All right, Shevuos, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Pilsum Mishpacha of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the shiurim and drashos this year as a zechus for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Iyar, Habalim Latova Shmuel Rabbi Karapkin, in commemoration of the yard site of Shmuel's father, Leonard Karapkin, Libba Ben Yecheskel HaKohen Zichrona Livracha. And our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Paul and Kathy Pollack, in celebration of Mishnah Yomi's completing Mishnah Avodah Zarah, with Hakaras Hatov to the Shir, to Kalman Akiva Kovacs, Emir Hashem, and for continued Hatzlacha in this beautiful endeavor. Let's say again, we hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamas will have an Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. Emir Hashem, continue to bring our hostages home, and we have tremendous Hakaras Hatov for the beautiful Neshama that was returned to Klal Yisrael yesterday. Halabai, the rest of our hostages should come home in Meretz Hashem. Our holy soldiers should be successful. B'chol ma'aseh yedeyhem, and we should truly share besoros tovos for all of Am Yisrael. So with that, let us begin. A lot to do today. Hashem, a beautiful daf ahead of us. Today's daf is Yud Beis 12. We are picking up on Yud Aleph Amud Beis 11b, and we are picking up Harei Para. All right, we really have a lot to do today. It is let's pick up 2, 4, 6, 7 lines down from the top. So we'll say again, 30-second review. So if you remember again, in the beginning of yesterday's after we were introduced to the riveting idea of Rabbi Yochanan. Ula, the name of Rabbi Yochanan, namely that halacha l'maaseh, if they are leftover karbanos, leftover tamidei tzibor, what do you do with them? So Rabbi Yochanan proposed this idea of simple redemption. You go ahead and you redeem them onto money. Right, transfer the sanctity of the animals onto money. That money then falls into the machzas shekel, last year's machzas shekel pot, used for temple repair, specifically for the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and ultimately the animals become chulin. Subsequently, the animals are repurchased from this year's machzas shekel, and you are good to go. That triggered a firestorm conversation. How can you do that? Karbanos have Kidushas Haguf, physical sanctity. If they have physical sanctity, so how are you able to go ahead and simply take that away with money? To which Rabbah introduces us to a concept, Leiv Bezdin Masna Alehen. Literally translated again, essentially, Bezdin stipulates, Bezdin essentially says like this, only the stuff that is used, only the karbanos, only the animals that are used, actually attain the full measure of physical sanctity, right? Everything else does not. Everything else does not. And therefore, halacha l'maaseh, you're not really redeeming physical sanctity because the unused animals never attained physical sanctity. Now, if that's the case, then why redeem them at all? Because you can't just take an animal out of the base of just start using it for mundane use. So therefore, you go through this model, this mechanism of what looks like redemption, but in reality, the animals never really became vested with Kidushas Haguf because they were never used. The Gemara then raises a couple of questions to this. The Gemara then qualifies this concept and says, well, really, Leiv Bezdin Masna Alein is only used in a shchiach case, in cases that are common. And that's why, again, in the cases of lost karbanos, which Baruch Hashem is good to hear, were an uncommon occurrence, so the concept of Leiv Bezdin Masna Alein doesn't apply. Good, that's where we're picking up. Now the Gemara challenges this idea again. V'harei para. What about paraduma? What about paraduma? So watch this. So v'harei paraduma de lo shchicha. So paraduma is an uncommon situation, right? Again, Rabbi, remember, it's the whole chap of paraduma. It was not an everyday occurrence, so it's considered to be what we'll call a lo shchiach, and yet, B'tanya we learn the following. Most of this is very interesting. Para niftis al kol psul sheba. A paraduma could be redeemed for any type of disqualification that develops within it. Okay, so that's fine. Rashi says over here, Rashi says it's about halfway down in the short lines of Rashi. Well, this is just a fascinating statistic. In all of the years of the first and second temples, there were only 7 paros adumos. Only 7 red heifers, all those years, right? Hundreds of years. only 7 paros adumos. Okay, Rashi goes on, al kol psul sheba, im iraba shum psul tifte. So again, in general, if a para aduma develops any kind of mum, so ultimately the para could be redeemed. Okay, that's not so much of a chiddush. Let's go on. Mesa tifte, if the para aduma dies, again, this is just it just dies, then halacha l'maisa, you could redeem it. Nishchata tifte, if it was slaughtered. Now Rashi points out over here, nishchata chutz limkomo. Let's say it was slaughtered outside of its prescribed area. You could also redeem it. Matzah cheres no'ayimenu. If you find a nicer para aduma, and that's not a reference to midos. That's like a reference, to again, you find not a more amicable para aduma. Again, you find a better para. So what's the halacha? Tifte. Ultimately, you could redeem the old one and utilize the new one. Shachta gabe ma'arachta. Now, once the para aduma has been shechted, right? Now, once it's literally been shechted and placed on the pyre, ein la pediya olamis. Ultimately, it does not have any kind of redemption. Now, I will say, let's take a look at Rashi just a moment. Rashi says, "Gabe ma'arachta behechshe behara mishchal or makom habaducha." Now, remember again, I will say, just as an aside, para aduma was not offered up in the Beis Hamikdash. Right? Para aduma is very unique. Where is para aduma? Or where is it offered up? On Har HaZeisim. Right? Now again, you can go to the site. You can go to the site where para aduma now, unfortunately, it's a monastery, but you can see the actual site where para aduma was offered up, and you can see exactly how it works. They offered it. Remember again, Har HaZeisim is a mountain. Har HaBayis is a mountain. The incredible part is that the area where the para aduma was offered up is directly across from the entranceway of the Beis Hamikdash. So you've been able to see into the Beis Hamikdash from there. So para aduma is unique. So when it says Gabe ma'arachta, that means on the pyre, but not in the Beis Hamikdash. On the pyre in Har HaZeisim, where it would have been offered. Finish that Rashi. He said, home, fine. Now here, so what do you see from this brisa? Pretty much you could redeem para aduma at any point in time, and for any reason, right? It dies, you could redeem it. It has a mum, you could redeem it. You find a nicer one, you could redeem it. The only time you can't redeem it is pretty much once it's offered up on its designated pyre. On Har HaZeisim, you can no longer redeem it. And Rashi says that's because it doesn't look nice, right? It's a ginai. It's a ginai. Ma'achnas is right. Ginaihu lo tzilcho. It doesn't look nice. It's been offered up on its pyre. What are you going to do? You're going to redeem it now and use it for a barbecue? Like it doesn't make any sense. Now, both say. Now, what do you see from here? Now, the assumption is para aduma has kedushas haguf, and yet again, it seems to be that you could redeem it for what? For any purpose. For any purpose, even without it developing a mum. Now, again. This would have troubled us much more yesterday, right? Or I should say before yesterday. Now it troubles me less because I understand how could this happen? How can you redeem something that has physical sanctity, kedushas haguf, even if it doesn't have a mum? How do you do that? Leiv bezdin masna lein. What's the problem? We just said leiv bezdin masna lein only applies when? Only applies in a situation where it's shchiach, where it's common. But this is an uncommon situation, and yet we're still saying leiv bezdin masna. So what's going on over here? Tushimar says, no. It's fascinating. Shiny para, the kache bedek habayisi. Wow, that's quite fascinating. The Gemara says, no, you got it wrong. Para aduma is not kedushas haguf. It's bedek habayis. Now, both say bedek habayis is a sanctity that is associated with things that are there for temple upkeep. So first of all, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Kedushas bedek habayis. Kilomar. Eina mekachem mizbech likadesh kedushas haguf lefichach niftis below mum ve'eina tzricha leiv bezdin. It's different. I will say, so para aduma doesn't have kedushas haguf. It doesn't have physical sanctity. Now, by the way, it makes a lot of sense. It can't have physical sanctity. Why? Well, he's pointing to the Gemara. If it had physical sanctity, then what? It would have to be offered up in the Beis Hamikdash. Right? The fact that it's offered up outside of the temple would seem to indicate that it's more financial sanctity, monetary sanctity, either what we'll call kedushas lamim or kedushas bedek habayis, but not actual physical sanctity. So the Gemara says, now, what's the beauty of that? Now remember, leiv bezdin masna alein. That concept is only necessary for items that possess kedushas haguf. Items that possess monetary sanctity, right? Those you understand that's a lower form of kedusha. So therefore, it makes sense that those could just be redeemed, just for whatever the reason. So the Gemara says, "Ihachi." Well, if that's the case, that paraduma is katshe bedakabayis, then mesa o nishchita tifteh. Then how could it be that if the para dies, right, or if the para is shechted, let's say outside of its prescribed area, that it can be redeemed? How could that be? Haba inan ha'amad v'aracha. The Bible said the general halacha is like this: anything that is katshe bedakabayis, right, that was dedicated for the temple, if it needs to be redeemed, it requires ha'amada v'ha'aracha, which means it has to be brought in front of the Kohen, literally stand in front of the Kohen, and its value assessed by the Kohen. If that's the case, then if the paraduma is dead, you can no longer bring it before the Kohen. If that's the case, then in other words, it has to be able to stand in front of the Kohen. If that's the case, then how can you redeem it? To which the Gemara says, not a problem. Hamani, Rabbi Shimon the Amar Kadshe Mizbeach Hayu Bichlal Ha'amad V'aracha. Kadshe Bedekabayis. Lo hayu bichlal ha'amad v'aracha. Okay, so says apparently this is subject to machlokes as well, and Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion that katshe bedakabayis do not require ha'amad v'aracha, and therefore halacha l'maisa could be redeemed. Okay, so the Gemara fine. So therefore the Gemara. So I just want to point out the power of these Gemaras are also like the information that we pick up along the way over here. So I don't know. This is quite striking that para aduma doesn't have Kedushas Haguf. I don't know, who would have ever thought that, right? Rather, Para Aduma, which is also, if you think about it, one of the most powerful forces we have in Yiddishkeit, the ability to go out and literally take away Tumas Meis, and the only way to take away Tumas Meis is Kedushas Bedek Habayis. It has monetary sanctity, essentially, not physical sanctity. So I just want to point out a tremendous Musar Haskell in this. Why doesn't Para Aduma have Kedushas Haguf? Why not? Why not? Because it's not offered up in the Beis HaMikdash. What do you see from here? That to really attain the highest level of sanctity, you must embed yourself in holy circumstances, right? In holy surroundings. It is not enough in life just to do the right things. You have to put yourself in the right avirah. You have to put yourself in the right atmosphere. A lot of us engage in a lot of I don't want to say self-deceptive practices, but we like to think that as long as I'm doing the right thing, it doesn't matter who I surround myself with, right? It doesn't matter who my friends are. It doesn't matter who I hang out with. It doesn't really matter the activities I engage in because, again, I'm strong enough to withstand any of those influences because I'm doing the right thing. And I may really be doing the right thing, right? I'm davening, I'm learning, I'm giving stuck, I'm doing chesed. So what does it matter? Okay, I know these guys are not the right influence. This activity is not really the ideal for my neshama, but I can withstand those influences. And it's incredible. The Gemara says that's not the way it works. It's not the way it works. Kedushas Haguf only comes when you embed yourself in a framework of Kedusha. It's only if you live in the Mikdash, if you operate in the Mikdash, that you have real sanctity. Otherwise, again, you could have Kedushas Damim. Absolutely, you could have physical sanctity, you could have monetary sanctity, right? But at the end of the day, you cannot achieve Kedushas Haguf. Tremendous Musar Haskell. The Gemara says as follows. We'll say it's also, you could take this concept much further also. This is also the power of Eretz Yisrael, right? What is the power of Eretz Yisrael over Chutz La'aretz? What is it? What is it? We have shuls in Chutz La'aretz, we have Batei Medrash in Chutz La'aretz, we have Torah in Eretz. The difference is that in Eretz Yisrael, one is embedding themselves in an absolute atmosphere of Kedusha. You cannot replicate that outside of Eretz Yisrael. You just cannot. In Eretz Yisrael, South Eretz Yisrael, you can find a lot of incredible pockets of holiness, but you cannot create the totality of a holy atmosphere. Incredible. Rabbi Shimon, okay, Rabbi Shimon, Ema Seifa, Shachta Agabe Ma'arachta, Okay, so now let's go back. So what did the Brisa say? Paraduma can be redeemed, but there's one point of no return. What's the point of no return? Once you shecht it on top of its pyre, on top of its ma'aracha, it cannot be redeemed. But Rabbi Shimon himself said, and this is fascinating, that para aduma has the ability, essentially is treated like food when it comes to tumah. when it comes to Tumah. Ultimately, why? Because since at a certain point it had a time when it was permissible. If you take a look at Rashi, this is in the wide lines of Rashi, about 5 lines in Metami Tumas Ochlin. What does this mean? So Rashi says over here, Im naga sheretz bibsara v'chazar v'naga b'sara ba'ochlin mitamasan, or timasan, excuse me. That literally, paraduma could convey Tumah just like food, right? A sheretz touches the paraduma touches another food item, could convey tumah. And yet Reish Lakish says, Rabbi Shimon says that a para, because of this, a para could be redeemed even after it's been put on the pyre. That contradicts what the Brisa said. Ella shiny para hoil vidameha yikarin. Rather, the Gemara says, you're right, paraduma in general ultimately, again, has a little bit of a different set of circumstances. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, it is incredibly expensive. Rashi says over here, Ella lo tukma Rabbi Shimon. Don't set up the price like Rabbi Shimon, like we were saying before. Ella l'gmar svahaydik tani matzeh nahe mena tifta mishum deleiv bezin masna aleh afagav lo shlicha. So also listen to this. We're actually reversing course, and we're saying reality. Why can you redeem paraduma? Rabbi says it's very important. Why are you allowed to redeem paraduma? Now, the Gemara is understanding that halacha l'maisa is like the brisa, which means if the paraduma dies, you could redeem it. If you find a mum, you could redeem it. You find a nicer one, you could redeem it. You shecht it outside of the prescribed area, you could redeem it. The only time you can't redeem paraduma is once it's been shechted on the pyre on harazesim. Why? Full circle, Bosai. Leiv Beis Din Masna Alein. That's the reason. Because essentially Beis Din says it's not called paraduma until when? Until it's actively shechted on the mizbeach. Anytime before that, ultimately you could redeem it in whatever fashion you want. What about the fact that we just said before that Leiv Beis Din Masna Alein only applies in the case of what? In the case of what? Shchiach. Common situations, and paraduma 7 over the course of both Batei Mikdash, totally uncommon. What's the answer? To which the Gemara says it's different, because since paraduma is so expensive and so unique, therefore again, Beis Din said, essentially, it's not paraduma until it's offered up on the Mizbeach, which means up until that point in time, you could swap it out for whatever you want. Incredible. So we'll say, so now in fact, it turns out, it is a din in Leiv Beis Din Masna Alein. Fascinating. So Amar Mar. So let's go back there. Amar Mar. Mesa Tifta. So the Gemara says, so now the Gemara is going back to the mechanics of this, right? So let's go through this. I have a paraduma. Paraduma dies. Okay, so obviously now it's not useful for me anymore as a paraduma, but it still has kedusha. So what could I do? I could redeem it. Transfer its value, transfer its sanctity onto money, and now the para itself becomes just chulin. So the Gemara says, what are you going to do with it? The Gemara says, Mesa Tifta. So what are you going to do? You're going to redeem the paraduma to go ahead and feed it to the dogs? First of all, that doesn't seem like the right thing to do. Even if the sanctity technically has been removed, what are you doing with the paraduma carcass? No, it's because of its hide. It does have a value. Even after its death, its hide. The Gemara says, really? So Leiv Beis Din Masna Alein is going to be there in order to preserve the hide. First of all, it's a cow, right? How much of a hide, right? And again, it's a small cow because paraduma must be young animals. So how much hide are you actually going to get? So because in order to preserve the value of the hide, so we're going to say Leiv Beis Din Masna Alein. To which the Gemara says, yeah, Amrav Kana, Amri Inshi, Migam La'ona. Yes, as the famous adage goes, an ear of a camel. Again, one of these that sounds much better in the Aramaic as well, right? But Migam La'ona, which means I will say sometimes if all you could salvage, from the camel is an ear, still you should do that. In other words, you're right, the hide of the paraduma, it's not worth that much, but it's something. And if you could recoup some of the value of the para aduma through redemption, Chazal wanted to enable that. Incredible. Eisvei, so they raised the kasha, Amrulo, Rabbi Shimon, Maushi Yikrevu, Ze Bazeh. So now we're going back to our Mishnah. Remember the case of the Mishnah was saying? So the Mishnah was speaking all about the Seirim, right? The Seirim of Rosh Chodesh, of the Regalim, of Yom Kippur. And again, the idea, remember from the Mishnah, is that all of those Seirim atoned for some type of Beis HaMikdash-centric tumah, or Kedusha-centric tumah, right? Whether it's entry into the Beis HaMikdash without knowledge, consumption of Kodshim without knowledge, and then there were different cases, right? yediyah betchila, ve'en lo yediyah besof, ein lo yediyah betchila, ve'yesh lo yediyah besof, ein lo yediyah betchila, ubasof, whenever there was a lapse of awareness. So the Gemara says as follows. In the Mishnah, they asked Reb Shimon, Ma she'ikrivu zeh bazeh. So we'll say, so now let's say, remember again, the Mishnah had the case, what happens if you lost the seer? Let's say the seer of Rosh Chodesh was lost, but it was found before a Yom Tiv. So can you offer up the seer of Rosh Chodesh on Yom Tiv? On Yom Tiv. So the Gemara says, Amar lahu, yikrivu. Rabbi Shimon says, yes, it's not a problem. You could offer up the seer of one on the occasion of another. Amar lahu, in kaparas and shava hein craven. How can you, so they say back to Rabbi Shimon, but how can you do that? Because different seerim atone for different things. How can you go ahead and offer up one for the other? Amar lahem, kulan ba'in lechaper al tumas mikdash v'kadashem. Rabbi Shimon says there's enough of a common denominator. What's the common denominator? They all come to atone for some form of tumah regarding the Beis HaMikdash and consumption of consecrated items. So because of that commonality, you could actually offer them up on, you could offer them up on different occasions. So you could offer up the Seer Rosh Chodesh on the Regalim on Yom Kippur, and so on and so forth. The Gemara says, boy, I even get into that. Va'amai lema leiv bezdin masna alehen. Why didn't Rav Shimon give an easier answer? Why didn't Rav Shimon say, of course you can? Why? Because leiv bezdin masna alehen. I will say, what does leiv bezdin masna alehen mean? That the animal only achieves its designated identity once it's used for that designated purpose. So, for example, if I have a seer of Rosh Chodesh that was set aside for Rosh Chodesh, and then that seer runs away, right? And I offer up another one in its stead, and I find that seer by Pesach. So now, of course, I could offer it up on Pesach. Why? Because L'maisa, we don't look at that as repurposing a seer of Rosh Chodesh for Pesach, but rather it never became a seer of Rosh Chodesh. Why not? Because leiv bezin masna lein. If you don't use it, it doesn't become designated for that purpose. So why not just give that answer? That's the easiest answer. The Gemara says, no. Reb Shimon ka'amrit. Oh, you bring up Reb Shimon, less leiv bezin masna lein. Wow. Okay. So what does say? Now it turns out that this concept is actually subject to machlokes. Apparently, Reb Shimon himself does not subscribe to this idea of leiv bezin masna lein. The Amar Rav Idi bar Avin, Amar Rav Amram, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Tmidin shelo hutzruchu l'tzibar. So listen to this. This is our case. I should say this is Rabbi Yochanan's case, right? This is how we started, right? So Tmidin. So again, comes Nisan. I have 4 leftover animals in the Lishkas Hatiloim for Karbanos Sibor, and I no longer need, I can no longer use them because they were purchased with last year's half shekel. So what do I do? So the L'divrei Rabbi Shimon, ein niftin tamimim. According to Rabbi Shimon, they cannot be redeemed unless they develop a mum. Incredible. They must require a mum in order to go ahead and be redeemed. So the Gemara says, L'divrei Chachamim, niftin tamimin. According to the Chachamim, they can even be redeemed without a mum. Now, Bosai, the Gemara is saying as follows. Now, the assumption over is, what's the machlokes? Leiv bezin masna leim. The Rabbanon hold leiv bezin masna leim. And therefore, again, Chazal said from the beginning, if these animals are not used for communal purposes, then ultimately, again, their kedusha could simply be removed with money. Reb Shimon rejects that idea. So the Gemara says, "V'Rabbanan the pligalei Rabbi Shimon manin." Who are the rabbis? Who are the people who are arguing on Rabbi Shimon? Name Rabbanan the Ketores. If you want to say it was Rabbanan the Ketores, because most remember again yesterday's daf we had the case of the Ketores, top of Yud Beis, right? Remember again. So in the case of the Ketores, we also saw another case where halacha l'maisa Ketores can be redeemed just with money. Now again, if you remember in yesterday's daf, the reason the Gemara said that was perhaps Ketores only possesses Kedushas Mammon, right? Kedushas Damim, and not Kedushas Legop. But anyway, the Gemara says, top of your base, shiny Ketores. Well, Ketores is different. Why? The Lav Bar Rayehi. Because I will say, there's no choice. Because by animals, you could say, let it graze until it develops a mum, and then redeem it. By Ketores, there's no mum. So because there's no mum, what exactly is the option for redemption, if not straight out redemption? So which the Rabbanan? Ella, Rabbanan de Para. Maybe it's the Rabbanan of Paraduma, who also said again that you can see, they say from Paraduma that lay bezin masna lein. To which the Gemara says, well no, Dilma Para shiny, Dilma shiny Para, did that mehal yikarin. Well, that's what we just said before. Maybe Paraduma in general is treated differently. Why? Because it's so unique and so expensive. So the Gemara says, Ella Rabbanan de Amru Lo. Rather, we'll say it's the Rabbanon of Amru Lo. What is that Amru Lo? That's a reference back to the Mishnah. If you take a look at the top Rashi on Yud Beis Medalef 12a, El Rabbanon de Amru Lo b'masnisin. V'hachi Amru Le hoil ve'in kaparasan shava v'les lach leiv bezdin masnishim avad bazeh yakriv bazeh lechapara acheres heich hein krivin. So we'll say. So remember again, the Rabbanon in the Mishnah, right? Let's go back to the Mishnah for just a moment. The Mishnah said, right? Let's just reestablish our facts. I have multiple seirim that essentially are offered up on Rosh Chodesh, Regalim, Yomim Tovim, and Yom Kippur. All of those, what's the commonality between all of those three buckets of goats, right? Those three buckets of seirim, the commonality is they're all offered up for some type of tumah infraction regarding entry into the Beis HaMikdash or consumption of kachim. They vary, but that's what they all focus on. What happens if I have my seir designated for Rosh Chodesh? It runs away, it escapes, I end up offering another one, and then I find it. So Rabbi Shimon says, no problem, just use it for the next Yantiv. So the rabbis, the Rabbanan said back to Rabbi Shimon, but how can you do that? They're designated for different things. To which Rabbi Shimon said, since they all share the commonality of Tumas Mikdash v'Kadashav, that's enough. Now, the Rabbanan agreed that it can be offered up, but for a different reason. The Rabbanan say it can be offered up, why? Because Leiv Bezdin Masna Aleihen. That's why it works. Because it turns out that when the Seir Rosh Chodesh was never offered up for Rosh Chodesh, it never attained that Rosh Chodesh sanctity. Therefore, once it's found, it can be used for the next Yantiv. But you, Reb Shimon, who don't hold of Leiv Bezdin Masna Aleihen, why do you allow for it? To which Reb Shimon says, because Hoil the Kaparasan Shava. Reb Shimon says they all have commonality of purpose. So because that could be offered up, that's the Rabbanan who argue on Reb Shimon. So Gemara says, "Mi ma'id Rabbi Yehuda." So in other words, how do you know that it's reflecting the view of Rabbi Yehuda? The Gemara says, "V'halchi kamarlei b'shtama ledidi damina lebeizin masna le'en amatu lahachi yikravu." So again, what conversation exactly is it that's happening over here? Now let's take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, "Mimai Rabbi Yehuda ka'amarlei v'islei nami in kaparas sheva Reb Shimon umishum le bezdin masnahu the kamosivla." So again, on both sides, how do you know that it's Rabbi Shimon who again disagrees with Rabbi Shimon? It's Rabbi Yehuda who disagrees with Rabbi Shimon, but ultimately holds it as le bezdin masna le. What's the conversation that's happening over here? V'halchi kamarlei is what it means to say. According to me, it works out well. That means le bezdin masna le'en because I hold that le bezdin masna le'en, and therefore what? Amatu lahachi yikravu. This is why if the seir of Rosh Chodesh is lost, for example, it could be offered up by the regalim. Ela l'didach, but according to you, the amrit lo, who do not subscribe to leid bezin and masna alein, amay yikravu. How can you take this seir that was lost, let's say by Rosh Chodesh, and use it for regalim or Yom Kippur? So the Gemara says, Dilma Rabbi Meir. Maybe this conversation is Rabbi Meir. What it means to say. According to me, this makes sense because I hold that all of the Seirim have commonality in purpose. In other words, they're all used. Kaparasan Shava means they're all used to atone for some type of Tumas Mikdash V'Kadashav. That's why if a Seir is lost for one occasion, it can be used for a different occasion. But according to you, why could it be? Why should it be offered up? Rabbi Yochanan says, Gemara Gamirla. Rabbi Yochanan says we have a Mesorah. The divrei Rabbi Shimon ein niftin, the divrei Chachamim niftin. So said we have a Mesorah. What's the Mesorah? According to Rabbi Shimon says it cannot be redeemed. According to the Chachamim, they hold it can be redeemed. And Abba say the assumption over here is that the point of contention is leiv bezdin masna alein. Ayel Rabbi Shimon, the less leiv bezdin masna alein. So Abba say so just so you understand what's the takeaway over here. The takeaway over here is what was originally introduced to us as a concept that everyone subscribed to now turns out to be a fundamental machlokes actually in our Mishnah on Daf Beis Medalef and Shevuos. Rabbi Shimon rejecting the notion of leiv bezdin masna alein, the Rabbanan upholding or accepting the concept of leiv bezdin masna alein. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon, the less leiv bezdin masna alein, my avdin lahu. So Rabbi says, now let's go full circle. Rabbi Shimon, so what do you do? No, let's go back for just a second, right? Because remember, how did we get into this whole leiv bezdin masna alein, right? How did we get to this? We got to this because we have a very practical issue that presents itself every single year. Every single year. What's the practical issue? Leftover karbanos. leftover sacrificial animals. So what are you doing with them? So again, if you hold Lev Beis in Masna Lein, as Rabbi Yochanan did, right, as the Rabbanon hold, like, there's a very simple mechanism. Redeem the animals, right? Redeem their sanctity onto money. Donate that money back to last year's Machzis HaShekel fund and repurchase the animals with new Machzis HaShekel. We're good to go. But you, according to Rabbi Shimon, if you reject Lev Beis and Masna Alein, so at the end of the day, what do you do with those leftover karbanos? To which the Gemara says, Am Rabbi Yitzchak and Rabbi Yochanan, makitzin bahenes hamizbeach. Okay, so this is very interesting. What do we do with it? Now, we've seen this phrase before. We use it for dessert for the Mizbeach. What does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi's in the short lines, about 4 lines in. Makitz bahenes hamizbeach, kisham mizbeach batal, at a time when the Mizbeach is dormant. Let's say again, no one's offering up any other karbanos on the Mizbeach right now. So makrivin osa ola lenedavas tzibor. She offered up as an ola. Again, on behalf, just a gift offering, a communal gift offering. Kidesh Aminu le Rabbi Shimon, Tamar Masnisin Gabi Sir Shelo Kara Bazeh Yikra Bazeh, Mishum Time the Kulan Ba'in Lechapra Al Tumas Mikdash Vekadashav, Alma Afa Gav Delav Hainu Dahi Kapara Gufa, Kavan the Shecha B'Mitzachsa, Karav La Hachenami, Elu Shelak Kulitzorach Tmidin, Velo Hutzrichu, Yikrivu the Ketzam is Berk Shari, the Shem Olo Hofreshu. So again, Rabbi Shimon says, simply, you don't redeem it. What do you do with the leftover karbanos? Offer them. Offer them. That's it. In other words, what do you offer them? As we'll get into this more. There were periods when there was nothing, no activity happening on the Mizbeach. Now, we don't like it. We don't like it when the Mizbeach is dormant, right? So what would they do in those moments where they were, it's hard to believe that it was ever dormant. But again, what would they do in those moments that it was dormant? They had like a dessert fund, right? And in the dessert fund, they would offer up just additional communal offerings. So those leftover animals would be used for the quote unquote Ketzam Mizbeach or Kaitzam Mizbeach, the dessert of the Mizbeach. Now, I want to point out something just tremendous Mosaskel. Why not? Just like so what? If there's no activity on the Mizbeach, leave it alone. So remember again, what's the whole avoda of the Mizbeach? The whole avoda of the Mizbeach is to serve as a bridge between heaven and earth. The whole concept of a carbon is kirvas Elokim, coming close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I will say the Mizbeach itself serves as a model of avodas Hashem. What is the core principle of avodas Hashem? The core principle? Never stop. Never stop. At the end of the day, a Yid always has to be active. A Yid always has to be spiritually dynamic. There's time for rest and relaxation, but even in rest and relaxation, I'm still active. I'm still doing, I'm still accomplishing. So to have the Mizbeach dormant, with no carbon, with no kirva, with no closeness, with no dynamic activity bridging heaven and earth, impossible. Impossible. You can't have that. That is it. Because again, the whole point is the Mizbeach is to serve as the paradigm for our avodas Hashem. And in our avodas Hashem, constant movement, constant dynamic forward momentum. So according to Rabbi Shimon, we don't need to redeem the animals, just use them. Just use them. That's it. Fascinating. So let's go back. We're not finished with that. Now listen, interestingly enough, now this works well for the animals left over in the Lishkas Hatzloim, because since they were already designated as communal offerings, so just offer them up as communal offerings. Not a big deal. Not a big deal. So the Gemara says, but even Rabbi Shimon will agree in the case of Seirei Chatos. Let's say you have leftover Chatos animals. Those cannot be offered up as dessert for the Mizbeach, but rather, again, those would have to be redeemed. Rashi says over here, Mod Rabbi Shimon, actually Rashi is right across, Mod Rabbi Shimon, Be'sirei hachatos, sheniknu mitrumas halishka shel shana zu, v'nisosra kigon sir sharash chodesh adar, sha'ava v'nimsa b'nisan, shei ro'ili karev od lechovas tzibor. So we'll say, this is very important. Let's say the Beis Hamikdash bought a seir, right? A sin offering of a seir, for tzibor purposes. What's a good example of that? The sin offering of Rosh Chodesh, the seir Rosh Chodesh, right? Again, remember we saw this was Shabbos' daf. Why is there a sin offering on Little Chazara? Why is there a sin offering on Rosh Chodesh? Kadosh Baruch Hu says, Hevi alai kapara, al shemi'atati es hayareach. Right? Bring for me an atonement because I diminished the power of the moon. So let's say you designated that carbon, right? It ran away. So you ended up offering up another one in its stead, and then afterwards you find it. So now we'll say, so now what happens? When do I find it? I find it after Rosh Chodesh Nisan. What's the problem? That's a sin offering that has been bought with last year's machzis shekel. So again, I will say, even Rabbi Shimon agrees that cannot be offered up on the mizbeach. V'hariyu leketz ha-mizbeach modu she'in makitzim megufo likarev hu ola ela b'damav sheyirach l'shiyumam yikach b'damav ola kaitzim mizbeach. And we'll say, now what's the reason for that? That can't be offered up. Why not? Because we'll say that's a chatos. That's a chatos. So a chatos could only be offered up for a very specific reason as a chatos. The problem is if you have this chatos from last year's machzas hashekel and wasn't used during that financial year, you can't use it. See, Rabbi Shimon agree in that case, you let the animal graze, develop a mum. Once develops a mum, then you could redeem it. You could redeem it onto money. Then you could use that money for an ola. So this is very important. So just to understand it, because the Gemara is going to go with this for a little bit. So again, Rabbi Shimon says, the leftover animals that you have at the end of the fiscal year, in the Lishkas Hatloim, that's easy. You don't need to redeem those. Just use those as dessert for the Mizbeach. Whenever the Mizbeach is dormant, why? Because those essentially were set aside for Ola communal use. Just use them for Ola communal use. That's it. So that's an easy one, right? That's an easy fix. If you happen to have leftover chatos, that's a problem. That's a problem because that cannot just simply be put on the Mizbeach for dessert use, because a chatos cannot be repurposed as an ola. But still there's a remedy as well. What do you do with that? Let it graze, develop a mum, then redeem it and use the money for, ketzah mizbeach, for a mizbeach dessert. So the Gemara says as follows, hashtahu demei kara ola, v'hashta ola. Did I skip? So again, in the case of the leftover animals, in the Lishkas Hatloim, they were initially designated as Ola, so offered up as an Ola, no problem. Aval Hasam to make Chatos, Vahashta Ola, Gezerah La'achar Kapara, Atu Lifnei Kapara. Rabos, in the case of the Seir, where it was originally designated as a Chatos, right, you can't go ahead and offer that up as an Ola. Now, what's happening over here is as follows. Technically speaking, you can, right? In other words, if I had a Seir designated as a Chatos for Rosh Chodesh, and then what happens? The Seir gets lost. I end up offering up another one in its stead. And then I find it afterwards. Technically speaking, I could offer that up as an Ola. What we're concerned about is if we allow that, you may come to repurpose a chatos and use it as an ola even before the chatos has been offered. That's asur. So in order to avoid that confusion, we essentially say, once an animal was designated as a chatos, you can't repurpose it for an ola. Beautiful. To which the Gemara says, Amar Abai, Afanan Amtinas. So now the Gemara is just going to prove this assertion, namely that once an animal has been designated as a chatos, even if another chatos has been offered up in its stead, you can't use that original chatos as an ola. That's all the Gemara is going to prove. So Abai says, I even agree with this as well. The Gemara says, Par v'sor Shem Kippurim. Listen to this. If you have the parents of Yom Kippur, Sha'avdu, that were lost, and you designated other animals in their stead and offered them up. So too, if you have the sir of avodah zarah, which is also a chatos, and it got lost, and you went ahead and you offered up other karbanos in its stead, and then what happens afterwards, right? So we'll say, then you find the original ones. Kulan yamuso divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says you have to let them all die. Rabbi Shimon Omer Omrim, no, yiru achi yistavu v'yimkaru v'yiplu d'meim l'nedava. No, let it graze, develop a mum, redeem it, and then you could use the money for nedava. Why? She'ein chatas tzibor mesa. Because at the end of the day, we don't leave communal chatas to die. Ay v'amai. Nikravu inhu gufayu ola, but what's the big deal? Just use it for ketzah mizbeach. Ketzah mizbeach, just use it for mizbeach dessert, right? After all, again, the purpose has been served already. Just repurpose it. To which the Gemara says, no. The Gemara says, inhu gufayu. V'amai nikravu inhu gufayu ola elalav shmamina gezerah la'achar kapara. So this is very important. Everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa, before the chatas has been offered, a chatas cannot be repurposed ultimately as an ola. Technically speaking, if you have a chatas it was lost, replacement was offered, and then you subsequently find the chatas, you really should be able to repurpose that chatas as an olah. Really, you should be able to, either because of leiv bezdin masna alein, right? Or just because the purpose has been served. But Lamaisa, we don't let you. Why? Because we're concerned if we let you do it after the chatas has been offered, you may come to what? Repurpose it even before. So therefore, essentially, there's a blanket halacha, no repurposing of a chatas for an olah. Good. Rava says, I also agree with this. So we'll say this is interesting. This is by the Seirim, the two goats of Yom Kippur. Right? If halacha l'maisa, right? Special, right? If halacha l'maisa, if one of the goats is lost, you have to replace both of them, right? So what do you do with the remaining goat? You let it graze, develop a mum, and then sell it off, and let the money be used for an adala. Va'amai, why is that so? Va'amai, yikrav ihu gufe olah. Just let the remaining one be offered up as an olah. No, once an animal has been designated as a chatos, it cannot be repurposed as anything else. I also agree with this. Asham shemesu bailov. If you have an asham, right, which is also another type of sin offering, and the owner died, ocean is katru bailov, or the animal was lost, and the owners used a different animal to achieve atonement. Let the animal graze, develop a mum, and then redeem it, and use the money to purchase an adava. The Gemara says, Rabbi Lazar, Omer Yamos. Rabbi Lazar says, ultimately, just let the animal die. Rabbi Shua Omer Yavi Bedamav Ola. No, use the proceeds and bring in Ola. Why not just offer up the animal itself? So the Gemara says, Ola, Elav Gzera La'achar Kapara, so I'll say all of these are backing up this same basic idea. So again, just to understand what's happening over here before we turn the page, right? So with time to spare, right? So we'll say so remember what's happening over here. The Gemara is saying like this: the reason we got to this whole lay beis in masna land was because Rabbi Yochanan said, "What else are you doing with the leftover karbanos?" Rabbi Shimon says, "I don't hold of lay beis in masna land," and there's another simple eitzah for the leftover animals. What do you do with them? Kaita mizbeach, dessert for the mizbeach, right? Why? Because since originally they were designated for communal offerings, use it for communal offerings. But even Rabbi Shimon agrees that only works with animals that were designated for all the purposes. But if you have an animal that was designated for a chatas purpose, you can never repurpose a chatas for an olah. The only way to go ahead and get it out of its chatas state is how? Let it graze, develop a mum, redeem it, and then you could use the money ultimately again for an olah. Taina Me'achir writes that supports this. Mahin maviyah mena masaros. So we'll say, what would they do? This is going back to what we spoke about before. You have leftover animals in the Lishkas HaTzloim at the end of the fiscal year. What do they do with them? So the Gemara will say, Amud Beis, Kayitz Kibnos Shuach Lamizbeach. They bring it on the altar, they offer it up on the altar like dessert, like white figs that people eat for dessert. Rashi says over here, Tap Rashi and Yud Beis and Yud Beis, Kayitz Kibnos Shuach like a person who goes ahead and brings for dessert, right? Brings figs for dessert. So too, you bring these animals on the karbano on the mizbeach as dessert. One second. You're allowed to bring figs on the mizbeach. Mark takes this statement quite literally. You're not allowed to bring honey. We'll say you can't bring leaven and you can't bring honey on the mizbeach, which bepashas means you can't bring figs on the mizbeach. Says, calm down. Kibenos shuachla, it's an expression. I didn't mean it literally, right? Again, it's just an expression, right? The same way that people commonly eat figs for dessert, so too, again, what do you do with leftover communal animals? You bring them as dessert for the mizbeach. Whenever the mizbeach is dormant, grab one of those leftover animals and use that. So Gemara says as follows. Good. Darash Rav Nachman bar Rav Chisda. So again, so just to understand what's happened over here is, we now have a fundamental machlokes, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yochanan says that halacha l'maisa, leiv beizin masna le'en. Rabbi Shimon disagrees with that, rejects that concept. What do you do with the leftover animals at the end of the fiscal year? Rabbi Yochanan, just transfer their sanctity onto money, give that money back into the machzah shekel pot from last year, use new machzah shekel to repurchase those animals, and then use them for communal purposes. Rabbi Shimon, you don't have to do that. Just use them for dessert of the mizbeach whenever the mizbeach is dormant. That's our raging machlokes. Here we go. So by the way, just as an aside, now that we're talking about kites on mizbeach, dessert of the mizbeach, Rav Nachman says you can only use animals, not birds, for kites on mizbeach. Okay, so the Gemara says as follows. Now Rashi says over here what that means is in lochin b'demei hanadava olas haov. So for example, Rabbi said, let's say you had a case where let's say you had a chatas that developed a mum, you sold it off, you used the money, now you want to use the funds to purchase for dessert for the mizbeach. You could only purchase animals, not birds. Not birds. Omer Rava, hai burcha. Rava says that's a lie. That's a lie, right? What are you talking? You made that up. Right? Fact check, right? It's actually interesting. Well, right? He doesn't say I disagree. It's actually very strong. You made that up. You made that up. Where do you know that from? What are you talking about? I made it up. I said it over before. And I said it over in the name of Rosim Minarda. It's very simple. It's very simple, right? Ultimately, again, whatever is left over, right? Whatever is left over, ultimately goes for nedavas sibor, right? Goes for right because that's kites and mizbeach, and ultimately, we know there is no such thing as a communal bird offering. So it makes sense. In other words, the only things that are offered up as dessert on the mizbeach, so to speak, are things that can be offered up as communal offerings. Only animals are offered up as communal offerings. Birds are never offered up as communal offerings. Therefore, it makes sense that you cannot go ahead and use sacrificial money to purchase birds for dessert for the mizbeach. That's all. I didn't make it up. So what the Rabbi say? Even Shmuel went ahead. Even Shmuel holds like Rabbi Yochanan. I will say now again, we're going back over here, back to Rabbi Yochanan, right? What does Rabbi Yochanan say? So leiv bezin masna lein. So even Shmuel agrees with this concept. Damar Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel, karbanos tzibor sakin moshchasan lemashein. Shabbos say this is a very interesting expression. So literally, again, when it comes to communal offerings, it is the knife that designates them for their purpose, which is another way of saying that a carbon only achieves. Is that rain? Is that rain? Good. But the carbon only. I should have brought a coat. I knew it. And so the carbon only achieves its purpose, its identity when it's shechted, which Rabbi say is another way of saying leiv based in masna lein. Right? Leiv based in masna lein says the carbon only achieves its designated identity when it's actively used. So sakin moshchasan ultimately again means the knife. The knife literally again pulls them towards their identity. So Shmuel holds like Rabbi Yochanan as well. That supports this. Umod Rabbi Shimon b'seir shemlo karav beregal yikar b'rosh chodesh. Rabbi Shimon agrees that by the seir. Now both say someone say that by the seir of Rosh Chodesh. If it was not offered up, let's say by Yom Tiv, right? It's offered up by Rosh Chodesh. Ve'im lo kara b'Rosh Chodesh yikra b'Yom Kippurim. And if you didn't offer up by Rosh Chodesh, use by Yom Kippur. Ve'im lo kara b'Yom Kippurim yikra b'Regel. And if you didn't use Yom Kippur, ultimately again use it by one of the regalim. Ve'im lo kara b'Regel zeh yikra b'Regel acher. And if you didn't use it this Yom Tiv, use it a different Yom Tiv. Why? Shemitchilaso lo ba ela lechapra al mizbeach hachitzon. Because at the end of the day, halacha l'maisa, it was only brought to serve for some atonement on the Adam Mizbeach, and therefore again it can be repurposed. So Rabbi says, so the way the Gemara ends off is halacha l'maisa. Well, again, it ends up with the machlokes. So fundamental raging machlokes. Do we say leiv based in masni alein or not? Rabbi Yochanan says yes. Rabbi Shimon says no. Rabbi Shimon says no. What is the halacha? So we'll say the Rambam Paskin. Let's close out the shir today with this. The Rambam Paskin is in Hilchos Shkalim. Hilchos Shkalim. Perek Dalet Halacha Yid Aleph. Here we go. Mishiagir Rosh Chodesh Nisan in Makrivin Karbanos Sibur El Mitzuma Chadasha. Once Rosh Chodesh Nisan comes, you can only offer up karbanos from the new Machzah Shekel collection. Vim Lo Ba Lefichach Imigir Rosh Chodesh Nisan V'Yeshiman Behemos L'Tvid Mitzuma Yishana. So what do you do if Rosh Chodesh Nisan comes, but I still have leftover animals that were purchased with last year's Machzah Shekel? What do I do? So what's the halacha? Podino's son. We redeem those animals, the yotzin l'chulin, and they become chulin, even though they are totally tamimin. And what do? the Yiplu Demei L'Truma Yishana, and I go ahead and ultimately, again, put their money back in the Machzis Shekel pot. Now, so the Rambam says essentially we could redeem those animals straight out. Now, what the Rambam doesn't add in over here is he doesn't add in that you have to repurchase those animals with new money. So apparently that's up to the discretion of Beis Din if they want to or not. But Allah Lamaisa, the Rambam says that we just redeem the animal straight out. Why? Shetanai Beis Din hu shekol al kol behemo shalokin letmidim shimlo yutzrichin lahem yetzu lechulin. Because it is a Tanai Beis Din that any animals that are not used for sacrificial purposes ultimately become chulin. Or in other words, we paskin halacha lemaisa leiv Beis Din masna alehen. We paskin like Rabbi Yochanan, we paskin like Shmuel Bosai. That is the halacha lemaisa. We'll stop over here for today. Shkoyach, everyone. All right, Chevranzim, have a great day, everyone. Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan.
Who is the one that says slave master?
No, Rabbi Yochanan was the one that said. Yeah, but I'm saying Rabbi Yochanan was on it. The way we were introduced to it. Correct. I'm saying the way we were introduced to it in the Gemara. Right, it's Rabbi Yehuda. Right.